OJ.
O.J. Simpson, yeah. So apparently my family watched that on the TV when I was being... And it was so hot that the power went out at the hospital. So I was delivered by flashlight and backup generator.
This explains so much.
How's that for a day one?
Wow.
Are you recording right now?
I am.
Nice. Welcome back to the Christ in Culture. This is Clint.
And this is Steve.
And Steve, it's good to see you, man.
Yeah. It's good to be back before gala season when I go MIA for a month.
Yeah. So just to clarify, so people who don't know what that is, you want to talk about your gala at work?
Yeah. So end of September we have our annual celebration of life, which is a gala. It's a big sort of fundraising event for the nonprofit Text Right to Life that I work for. August isn't as bad as September, but kind of by mid-August, things start to pick up a little at work, and then when September hits, it's all hands on deck for a month, and I disappear.
Yeah.
And by disappear, I mean...
We barely saw you last year during gala season.
Yeah, I think I invited people to the gala because I was like, I've neglected my friends for like 2 months. It's time to see them for one night, and then I neglected them there because I was working. But yeah, this is my life. So let me ask you a question, Clint.
All right.
What media are you intaking?
Oh, you're jumping straight into that. All right. Hold on, I actually had some notes here.
Oh, I caught him off guard, people. You saw it.
Yeah,
first.
I was getting ready for the banter, man.
Yeah.
It's all good. It's all good. So, I've been listening to Acquisitions Incorporated, the C-Team podcast again, which is my Dungeons and Dragons podcast to listen to. Have you seen Stranger Things season 3?
I have.
Okay.
I binged it in one day.
Yeah, so did I. And the song from episode 8, this is not a major spoiler alert, so don't freak out if you haven't finished it yet, but you should go finish season 3. In episode 8, they sing Never Ending Story from the movie Never Ending Story, and I am like obsessed with that right now. I've listened to it on repeat like way too many times.
Specifically that rendition?
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, did you know there's like, they have challenges for everything now, but now there's a never-ending challenge. It's like a dance video type thing. It's weird. So I've been listening to that like crazy, and then Ed Sheeran just dropped a new album, which is just called Number 6 Collaborations Project, and basically every single song on there is featuring at least one or more like big name artists. It's like a powerhouse of big name artists. I don't like most of it, to be honest, and I'm a huge Ed Sheeran fan, but some of his newer stuff is getting less Ed Sheeran-y, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, people sell out every day.
Yeah. So a couple songs on there are decent. It's kind of ironic. The very first song on there was all about like, just because we look rich and happy and beautiful on the inside, we're really like broken, talking about like celebrities and stuff. And that's probably one of my favorite songs in the whole album. And then the very next song is like Cardi B and someone else, and it's all talking about like the exact opposite of what that song was just talking about, how they find their happiness in like partying and like money and stuff like that. It's like, this is very contradicting. So not a huge fan of the album, but maybe a few songs will grow on me. And then last night I went with Gordon and the rest of the Shrine kids and missionaries to go see Spiderman Far From Home.
I haven't seen that movie yet. I want to go see it. I had a group of friends that went, but I couldn't go, and then I had another group of friends that I kind of talked to about it, and then they went and didn't tell me. I'm just a little bitter.
A little bit, yeah. Sorry.
But it's fine. I'll just go see it by myself.
Going to the movies by yourself is actually kind of fun.
Yeah.
But you're an extrovert, so you might disagree.
Well, it's not like I'm talking anyway, so I don't really care.
It's true.
It's just nice to have that person to, after the movie, be like,
hold hands with?
About this. Yeah. This is actually just a cry for help. No, it's not. No, anyway.
All right, so what are you taking in?
I binged season 3 of Stranger Things on Friday after it came out.
Okay.
And so I had to work that Friday, the 5th. But when I got home, I turned on Netflix and watched it for the next 9 hours or whatever. And it was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and I like was on episode 7, and I was like, I'm so tired, I'm ready to go to bed. Because it was still past my bedtime, but I was watching Stranger Things, so I kind of lost track of time. But I was already at episode 7 of the 8-episode season, so I stayed up till 4 a.m.
Dang.
It was dumb, but it's a great season.
Did you have to work on Saturday?
I didn't. No,
Oh, that's good.
so I slept for like most
Yeah.
of Saturday. Other than that, I found out from a friend that this movie was on Netflix. I haven't been intaking as much media as I would have liked. I've just been busy with work and stuff, but living under a rock basically. But
Patrick.
oh, I did actually start watching the Netflix show The Mist. I was talking to you a little bit about this. It's interesting. It's very different than Stephen King's novella or the 2007 rendition of his novella. It's just I think it was originally on Spike, and now it's on Netflix. But it's a show called The Mist. I watched a few episodes. It's all right. I'll probably continue to watch it just for the purposes of doing a podcast on it at some point.
You said it had some themes that were kind of like hinting towards being anti-Christian or anti-Catholic.
Well, yeah, so it's
specifically.
interesting. They've got a priest in it, and he's like actually seems like a pretty decent guy, but you can kind of see that they're laying the groundwork for making him
The bad guy.
yeah, or at least just kind of like an idiot,
Yeah.
because he's trying to make sense of what's going on in terms of like the Bible. And then there's this like woman who is literally just like a hippie, like that's it. Like her character is just like, you're polluting too much, and like basically like they draw a lot of cinematic view in the first episode, like people killing an insect and stuff, because in Stephen King's original rendition there are these like monsters that like resemble giant insects, and they're the things killing people.
Yeah.
Well, in the show that's not really what's happening, and it's kind of like nature rising against humanity as like a stop polluting sort of thing, like
Right.
which like I get, and that's pretty popular. And all in all, like I'm very pro stewardship of the earth, so like I get that.
I would hope so.
It just, but sometimes it feels a little preachy, and especially I'm kind of like, especially when it like tries to contradict and be like, oh well, yeah, it's like the church is trying to like make sense of it, and like she's like in the church and she says something like basically this guy dies, and he dies because he like moth wings sprout out of his back, and then moths fly out of his mouth, and he like dies. And she's like, that was God, and like the priest is like, that was not God. And she's like, no, I'm not talking about your God, I'm talking about the real God, nature. And it's like,
That's very unnatural, so...
yeah, like it's not something that naturally happens. Yeah, it's very interesting because like it's just, that's like the part that's like, you're like, interesting, because it's trying to like basically, I don't know, it seems very, sometimes like from what I've seen, it seems very anti-Christian, and like the priest is kind of going down that slow way that they always do, where he's going to become sort of like puritanical monster.
Right. Yeah, and that's typically how Christians and Catholics are portrayed in movies nowadays, unfortunately.
So I'll probably watch it, and we'll probably just talk about that theme in general and why that might be. But that's a different podcast for a different day. But today I watched not today, but like for today's episode, I did watch a movie that was on Netflix that my friend told me about. I wanted to see it in theaters, never got around to it. Spiderman Into the Spider-Verse,
yeah.
The animated movie, basically
So, Not Far From Home.
Not Far From Home, not the newest one. This is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. It's like about the multiverse. My friend told me about it. My friend Anthony Carboni. I don't know if you know him.
Doesn't sound familiar.
Anthony works at NASA. He's a good friend of mine, and he was basically telling me it's probably the best Spider-Man movie he's ever seen.
Yeah, I've actually heard that a lot too, actually. A ton of people are saying it's the best one.
Yeah, so I checked it out, and it was pretty good, actually. Yeah. I liked that it actually referenced some of the live-action movies, especially like the Tobey Maguire movies.
Yeah. I know a lot of people were hoping that the actors would be played by, like, Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, and Tom Holland.
Yeah.
But, oh well.
What ended up happening is there's, like, in the beginning, and they do this a couple times, of like, because there's, like, several different Spider-Men that appear.
Right.
Because because it's like a multiverse thing, so they're from different multiverses.
And a Spider-Woman.
Yeah, and a Spider-Woman. And various
Spider
spider
pig.
persons.
Spider-Pig.
Yes, various spider anthropomorphized things.
Yes.
There's like a scene where he in the very beginning where he's talking about like he's like, yeah, like I do this, I like swing in, I save the day, like I'm Peter Parker, and he's like, I've done this, I've done that, and I've done this, and it's like an animated version of the scene in like Spider-Man 3 where he's like dancing and doing the pointing and stuff.
Yeah.
And he's like, we don't really talk about that. He's like, this happened. He's like, and this definitely happened. And it's like that scene, and he's like, but we don't really talk about that. And I thought that was just a really funny kind of.
Because that's the series that everyone kind of rags on a little bit.
But it was really good. But there's some really cool themes in it. All in all, have you seen it?
Yeah, I watched it back in like March or April.
When it was probably in theaters.
No, I watched it on a plane actually.
Oh, rock on. It's I think got some pretty cool themes in it in general.
Mm-hmm.
So the plot, really quickly, for a little bit of a spoiler, is that the original Peter Parker dies. And Miles Morales, who is the Spider-Man in the Ultimate series of Marvel Comics, like Ultimate Spider-Man.
Oh, he's actually from a series.
Mm-hmm. Miles.
Oh,
So
okay.
the Miles, like the Ultimate Universe, Miles Morales is Spider-Man.
Okay.
And so they're kind of giving him a little bit of a show. And they've done it in different media, like the Spider-Man PS4 game has Miles in it.
Really? Yeah, see, I don't know the lore behind most of the superheroes.
Yeah, you have all these things kind of happen. It's really interesting, yeah, because like in that game, you play as Peter Parker the whole time. And there was like a couple scenes where you actually play as Miles, but he doesn't have his spider powers.
Okay.
And it's like all before he becomes a Spider-Man. So basically into the Spider-Verse, Miles gets bitten by a radioactive spider, and then
spray painting.
Graffitiing
uncle.
with his uncle. And then he goes back to like find it because he like realizes he has power. He's getting powers. It's actually interesting because I didn't know this until I thought about it later. But like that spider kind of like shifts in the same way that those from other universes shift. And so he was actually bit by a radioactive spider from one of the different universes. Because
really?
know how it does like that weird like shifting when something's from another universe?
Yeah.
That spider does that shift.
It's true.
So I was like, oh, it must have been a spider from a different universe. Which would be why I guess it bit him, because it is the radioactive spider, right?
Right.
And so he goes and he sees Spider-Man and basically witnesses Peter Parker get killed. And then he is the only Spider-Man in the universe.
With no training.
With no training, no idea what he's doing.
Or something
he's
like
like 15. He just watched, what's his name? Wilson Fisk. That's it. He witnesses Wilson Fisk kill Peter Parker. And so then all of these other spider people get poured out into his world, including another Peter Parker.
Yeah.
Who is from a far-off future. That's actually, it's kind of interesting because a lot of them are nods to the different universes and different Spider-Man comics.
Right.
And so there is a Spider-Man comic where, and it was actually, I think, around that time where, like, MJ and Peter Parker were no longer married.
Yeah. And so this new Peter Parker coming in is like...
They got a divorce, yeah.
He's divorced. He's like kind of washed up, gained a lot of weight, is not really being Spider-Man anymore. He kind of just sits in his apartment and drinks and eats, basically.
Yeah. And so he's kind of beat up, and it's actually kind of poking fun because there is like in the comics that actually I think happened maybe, but anyway, I digress. And so he goes about training Miles after Miles basically begs him.
Right. Very unwillingly.
And so there's this theme where he actually is the one who sticks up for him. All the other Spider-Men kind of realize that he's not ready. Like, Miles is not ready. He doesn't have control of his powers. And he'll get himself killed. But their whole point is they're going to wait until because basically the reason that all that's happening is there's like a super collider underneath New York that Wilson Fisk is using to try to open up portals to other universes to bring back his family.
Right.
Which I think is actually an interesting theme because he doesn't recognize why it happened. Like, he was fighting Spider-Man. What happens is Wilson Fisk at some point in the future was fighting Spider-Man, and he's holding him by his neck trying to kill him, and his family and Wilson Fisk's family walks in and sees this, and then they realize that Wilson Fisk is a monster, and they get in their car to run away from him because they're leaving him, and then they get hit by a car and die.
Yeah.
And Wilson Fisk is so bent on bringing them back, even trying to kill Spider-Man. And he doesn't seem to realize, and actually they play at that a little bit when he's on the train and like all the universes are colliding, and he sees his family and they run away again after he's like holding holding Miles.
Yeah, and he kind of
and
loses
he just replays that whole scene again because what it's trying to show is that it's not Spider-Man's fault that they died. It's like that Wilson Fisk is who he is, and it was inevitable, like with him being the criminal that he was, that they were going to eventually find out and leave. And that's why they left. And unfortunately, they died. But he's trying to bring them back, but he's like not repenting or changing. And I just think that's kind of an interesting theme. Because it's just, even if he brought them back, it was just going to replay itself out.
Right. And it kind of makes like this endless loop where he keeps doing it and keeps falling into the same thing.
Yeah. So there's two kind of big themes, I think, in the course of this movie. I think thread-wise.
Okay.
There's really two big stories happening. There's Peter Parker.
Which one?
The living one. From this point forward, when we refer to Peter Parker, we will refer to living Peter Parker.
Okay.
From universe whatever. That Peter Parker, and then Miles. I think those are kind of the two main storylines happening. And they're generally happening together. But you've got this one where you've got Peter Parker who feels broken. He's made a lot of mistakes, and he can't live with it.
Right.
And so what they want to do is jump back into the stream, get sent to their universe, or else they'll die, right? Because their body can't handle being in a different universe, so they keep like glitching, basically, like that spider, until they'll eventually die. But one of them has to stay behind. And so Miles wants to be the one that stays behind because it's his universe, he'll live, and if anyone else stays, they'll die to close it.
But he has to be able to...
But he has to be able to use his powers, and he can't. And so the Peter Parker whose life is seemingly kind of ruined is like, I'll stay. And he basically tells Miles that he can't do it. He's like, you're not ready. It's my call, not theirs. And he's like, well, I can do it. And he's like, all right, well, like, electrocute me. Like, use your power. Like, use your power on command, and, like, Miles can't do it.
So they try, like, scaring him into it and, like, everything.
They do everything they can, but he just can't seem to do it. So he gets all wrapped up. So I think that there is, like, again, two storylines going. I think there's the storyline of despair and purpose that is explored. Like, there's this idea of, like, being in despair and hope, which we've mentioned before, but also, like, having a sense of purpose that you see within the Peter Parker's character.
Yeah.
And then in Miles' character, he keeps saying, like, how do you know when you're ready? Like, how do you know you're ready to be Spider-Man? And they keep saying, you don't. It's a leap of faith. Because in the comic, because he's, like, reading a comic to see how his universe is Peter Parker. Right. And he's like, I don't know if I can do this, like, shooting the webs or anything, but he just jumps off a building and trusts that he'll be able to do it. And he, like, Miles does that. He goes up to a building, then runs down and goes to a smaller building because he's afraid and he won't do it. And so he's like, he doesn't want to take that leap of faith.
And so because of that, he can't grasp his powers. He can't control them. Yeah.
And so those, I think, are the I guess, themes, the real big themes of this movie that I want to get into.
Yeah, I think something that might help us get started here. I just pulled up a couple quotes that were good. So per usual, Stan Lee had his cameo, which is always cool. And there's one where you were just talking about how he goes to the comic store, and that's where he sees Stan Lee. And so Stan says, I'm going to miss him, talking about Spider-Man as Miles is buying like a costume. Yeah. And it's like he's buying a costume to be like a little kid who's a fan, but really he's buying it for
and actually
himself.
It's at the funeral, everyone's dressed up as Spider-Man and like an homage to him. So he like wears that to the funeral.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And so Miles is like, yeah, and Stan says, we were actually friends, so it's like a throwback to the fact that he made it. And then here's the part that I want to focus on. Miles says, can I return it if it doesn't fit? And Stan says it always fits eventually.
Right. And there's like, it's kind of a funny scene because then like he looks over and there's a sign that says no refunds ever, and Stanley's just smiling at him.
Yeah.
But it is actually a serious note because that's something that they say in the beginning with Peter Parker, like when he was still alive, the dead Peter Parker.
Mm-hmm.
Saying in the beginning is that he's like, I'm just some guy in the mask, and anyone can be Spider-Man.
Yeah.
It could be anyone, and Miles kind of repeats that at the end. It's this idea that who's behind the mask? Well, it doesn't matter because like anyone can be Spider-Man. Like anyone can be a hero.
Yeah, and
anyone can do the right thing.
Right, and I think going back to what you were talking about, despair versus purpose.
Mm-hmm.
When we're called to something, when we're like actually called to do something, even if it doesn't feel right at first, if it's actually what we're called to do, it'll always fit.
Yeah.
Right? And that's not to say like if you hate it, then you're probably not called to it, right? But if you are legitimately called to something, God made that for you, right? So does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. But there's also another quote that went along with that I wanted to throw in if I can.
Yeah.
So it says, this is Stan Lee again, that person who helps others simply because it should or must be done and because it is the right thing to do is indeed, without a doubt, a real superhero. So that's going back to what you were just saying about how anyone can be the quote-unquote superhero as long as they do what needs to be done, as long as they do, like, what is good.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's like kind of what's explaining why they kind of show Miles as realistically just like a high school kid that is figuring himself out and doesn't have a clue. Is like if he can become Spider-Man, anyone could be a hero. So to explore the alternate Peter Parker's lifestyle, he basically is willing at the end to sacrifice himself because he feels like, well, at the end of the day, all of these other Spider-Men have lives to go back to.
Yeah.
But he's like, I don't have anything. And it's like really funny because like they go to the basically like the spider cave, right? Like the headquarters.
Which is pretty sick. It's like Peter Parker from this world's like headquarters in the basement of his shed in the backyard, but it's got all of his super suits and everything and super fancy and everything.
Yeah, it's like cool. It's really, really nice. And Miles like, is this what yours is like? And he's like, yeah. He's like, he's like, imagine this, but without the plane or the car or the suits, or a little bit smaller, and imagine a futon there. And it's like his apartment.
Yeah.
But that's kind of that Peter Parker, right? He's lost MJ. He's lost everything that really means something. And it's because he didn't want kids, right? MJ wanted to have kids, and it scared him. He wasn't ready to have kids. And it's actually really funny because like he was like, Miles, I'm so proud of you. And he's like, wait, do I want kids? And it's like really funny.
Yeah.
But there's this idea of like having second chances because the end of the movie after the credits, and I think it's after the credits, or no, not quite, but he goes back to MJ at the very end. He's got flowers and he like goes to go back to her because he's making a second chance because throughout the movie he feels like he lost his purpose because he had nothing else to live for, right? He lost MJ. He lost everything important to him. Aunt May died. I mean, all these people that were important to him passed on. And then he goes back, but he has this whole thing where he's retraining Miles, and almost Miles reignites in him this sense of purpose.
Right.
And so I kind of want to hear what you think about just the importance of that, like, sense of purpose, right? Or even this idea of, like, recognizing that we have a purpose and maybe discerning that. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
You just think, what is a sense of purpose? Why is it so important to us?
Sure. I think that's one of the things that a lot of people find attractive about Christianity is that people who are authentically living their Christian faith typically feel like they have a sense of purpose because they're living for something greater than what's immediately in front of them.
Yeah.
I think especially in like the early church, because you see people so on fire for their faith that like there's public martyrdoms happening all the time, which to be fair, like there's more martyrdoms now than there were in the ancient church, but unfortunately it's not something that we focus on or a lot of us kind of ignore. Yeah, so I just think if we are living our Christian faith authentically, we recognize that God has called us to do something. We're not sure what that is, and that's why we have discernment. And to clarify, discernment is not just like us making a decision. I know I had a conversation with some of my high schoolers probably a couple months ago now, and we were talking about discernment, and they're like, yeah, discernment is just like deciding what you want. And I'm like, no, discernment is like communicating with God and trying to understand what he wants for you, because that's what's best, right? Even though it might not seem like it at times. That's kind of what I was trying to get at before. When you actually get into what you're called to do, it's the thing that'll bring you the most joy and peace on this, or in this life. Right.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to note that, God does create each of us uniquely for a specific purpose that only we can fulfill.
Right.
It's not like if you turn down what you're called to, your vocation, that God's like, oh, well, time for plan B.
Yeah.
Like he can make all things work.
You are plan A through Z.
Yes. Like you are the plan.
Yeah.
And that God cooperates through us. That God's providence, that God's plan happens through his cooperation with us. That he allows us to play a part in salvation. He could just change things, but he allows us to work.
And that's actually another thing from the movies. So Peter Parker, the living one, talks to Miles and is like, there's one thing I know for sure. Don't do it like me. Do it like you. And he's talking about how to be Spider-Man.
Yeah.
Right? And yeah, because before we were talking about how anyone can be a superhero, but not anyone can fulfill the specific role of superhero that you're called to be.
Right. Yeah. And so I think that there's a lot of growth that happens with that Peter Parker. But also Miles, going just back a little bit to him, in this leap of faith. I think one of the most powerful moments of the film is he's like, it's kind of funny, and he's actually in his most broken state. He's all wrapped up in
his
room,
dorm room,
in his dorm room, and he's got all of he's like wrapped up in a web, and he's like kind of despairing. And then
the spider people like trapped him in his dorm room because he hadn't controlled his powers, and so it would have been dangerous for him to go.
And so he has two specific powers that are unique to him. He has electricity, like he can hit you with electricity, shoot electricity off of his body, like supercharge himself or go invisible.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
And so he's sitting there in the chair, and then he finally has this moment where he's like, all right. And so he just explodes the things off of him. Like he finally gets control of his powers, In
his brokenness and in his desperation.
In his desperation.
And I think we can even start from there, because a lot of the times it's in our brokenness and in our desperation where we finally accept that we're not good enough.
Yeah.
Right? And that we need to rely on God.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Which is, that's not where the powers in the story come from, but that's where our powers, it's where our abilities, it's where everything that we are and can do comes from God. And so it's in our brokenness usually where we start to realize, oh dang, I can't do this. I need you, God.
Right. Yeah, and it's in our weakness that we are strong, right? And so he does that, and then his roommate wakes up and sees all the webs everywhere and just goes back to bed, and it's because Miles is in the room but he's invisible.
Yeah.
So he goes back, he finds he gets to Aunt May, he gets the suit, and Aunt May's there, and it's so funny because she believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. And I think that's kind of how God is for us, that he shows up.
Aunt May is so great.
Yeah, he shows up to the spider cave, and she's like, it's about time you got here. Because she knew he was going to be able to do it.
Yeah.
So she trusted him and believed in him. And I imagine that's how God is when we finally arrive. We're supposed to be. He's like, oh, about time you got here.
Right.
But he gives him the suit, which he kind of makes his own. He uses his spray painting abilities, makes it his own, and then he gets the little web slingers, and he goes to literally the tallest building and jumps off it.
And he finally makes that leap of faith.
And he makes the leap of faith from the highest tower he can.
Mm-hmm.
And he gets there and he saves the day, right? But he makes that leap of faith. And so I kind of I'm interested to kind of explore that theme making a leap of faith, or what is a leap of faith, and why is it important that we as Christians sometimes make that initial leap of faith? Because it's always so interesting, because you talk to people and about Christianity, and like I know that God can reveal Himself, and I know that I know He's real, and that He has, in many aspects of my life, continuously revealed Himself to me, like on a personal level. But it's hard to explain to somebody who has no faith, how do you begin that process? And it's oftentimes, well, you need to take that initial leap of faith, and you won't be disappointed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot to say in this. First off, I think when we say faith, a lot of the times people use that as an excuse of there's no proof, so you just have to have faith. That's not really the case, right? There's a lot of evidence for a lot of different things in our beliefs, and faith is a part of that, but not separate from that. For example, people say there's no way to prove there's God, you just have to have faith. That's not really true. A lot of philosophers believe that it's possible to reason your way to God, right? And that's why we have Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways and different stuff like that. But faith is one of the theological virtues, right? So we have faith, hope, and love. What makes the theological virtues different from the other virtues is that we can't obtain them only on our own.
Yeah.
And so faith, hope, and love are all things that we can only get through God's grace. That's why it's called theological. Theos meaning God.
Yeah.
And so this idea of faith has to come from God, and it's this idea that even beyond our understanding, even beyond our reason, we know, trust, and believe that God's still there, right? So even when we have our dark times and it feels like God's not there, we have this faith that reminds us
that He is.
That He is.
And that He has a plan.
Right.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm getting at is I've often found, going into my story, God very much revealed Himself to me in a very real and tangible way. But that happened when I was actually open for it.
Yeah.
And when I first desired for Him to reveal Himself, He didn't, because I was trying to force it so much. And I took this leap of faith where I realistically was you know what, God, that's fine. Whatever it is you want to show me.
Yeah.
And it was that openness of just trust of you know what, I'm not going to force my way. I'm just going to be open to it. And that's when God actually revealed Himself.
Right.
And so there is an aspect of not testing God, but trusting God. And that's what the leap of faith is.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's less of a physical leap of faith and more of a letting down your walls. And so maybe we can even argue that the true leap of faith was when he was in his dorm room, broken and defeated, and said, okay.
Yeah.
Let's
and I would actually argue the same thing, that jump symbolized it, but he had already had control of his powers.
It was the sacrament, if you will.
Yeah, but he already had control
the tangible
of his powers.
sign of the interior change. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And so that's kind of the movie. Is there any other massive themes that you would like from the movie that you would like to cover?
It's been a couple months, so I'm trying to think of something else, but
because there is the and we kind of already talked about the Wilson Fisk, which is another thing, right? Is grief and how we can let that consume us.
Yeah, we can talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any initial thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I kind of already mentioned it with Wilson Fisk and how his grief basically is this never-ending cycle, but there's something to be said about grieving has its place and it's important. And I think there's grief, and I think there's a lot of guilt there. And sometimes our grief can look like survivor's guilt.
Yeah.
And we can let that consume us. And there is a point for us to grieve the loss of something or someone. But when that consumes us, then we begin to miss out, right? It ends up consuming us, and then we almost become our grief.
Right.
Our grief defines us. And this is one of those things that I was talking to one of my coworkers about what actually makes us who we are. And the answer because they're trying to be like, well, at what point do like our actions or our choices make us who we are, blah blah blah. And I'm like, well, like it's like, okay, well, we're all called to something. And it's like, what if you never live up to who you're supposed to be, like who God calls you to be? Does that mean you're not you, or you're somebody different? And I was like, well, on the same side of the token, if I were to walk outside right now, get hit by a car, and become a quadriplegic with severe brain damage for the rest of my life, am I any less Steve Sherman? And the answer is no.
No.
I'm still just as much of me, independent of my faculties or abilities, right?
Right.
Like I'm still me. And so what actually defines us? And so I think like the issue with letting grief define us, or sort of being so consumed by it, is that we begin to not really be who we are. We begin to define by this action that happened to us.
I think that's true to a certain extent. I think obviously grief is a very good thing.
Yeah.
Because it helps us to recognize that life is a gift, and it's beautiful, and it helps us to treasure that more. And like we said before, it's at our most broken and feeling the lowest where we cling to God the most. And I know we see a lot of the times the opposite is happening. So when someone dies, people will say like, God, where were you? Instead of saying, God, I need you.
Right.
But a lot of good can come from that, right? And grief is good. We see Jesus grieved when Lazarus died, right? It was John 11:35. Jesus wept, the shortest verse in the entire Bible.
Yeah.
But also extremely powerful just in that statement, because he's showing it's a good thing to grieve.
And actually, I actually want to kind of get into that scripture passage in
Sure,
general.
yeah.
Because I love that scripture. Because before...
It's David's favorite.
You have to like look at it.
Yeah.
Because Christ knows who he is.
Yeah.
And he knows Lazarus was a good man. And he even mentions to them, when they're like grieving, like, if you were here, this would not have happened. And he's like, do you not believe in the resurrection of the body? Like clearly Jesus believes it. Like he knows that this is not the end of Lazarus. And he knows he can raise him from the dead.
And he does.
And he does. But he weeps anyway.
He grieves
He grieves
first.
anyway.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to remember that our God is actually on our side.
Yeah.
And he grieves with us. That we sometimes forget in our little American mindset. Sometimes it's a very deist mindset.
Yeah.
That God's all the way up here and we're down here in suffering. And we pray to him and he zaps down some prayers and he fixes it.
It's the genie mentality.
Right? But like that's a very deist mindset, but that's not the God of Scripture.
Right.
The God of Scripture is not a God up here while we're down here suffering. He is a God who comes down into our suffering along with us.
Yeah.
And that is our God. That is God. And so, yes, I think the grief has obviously a place. What I'm saying is, and you actually kind of even see it with Wilson Fisk when, in the very beginning, before Peter Parker dies, is fighting him, and he says it can't be worth it, to accidentally open up a black hole and maybe destroy everything. And Wilson Fisk says there's more than just money.
Yeah.
Right, because he lost his family and he realizes that it's not just always about the money. There's something else. And so that's a really a good theme.
Well, I think even going along with that some more, where grief, and you hinted on this already, grief is good as long as we don't let it consume us.
Yes.
Right? But as Christians, we need to remember, like, there is hope beyond the grief. And I think that's where I was getting at, and you were getting at with the Jesus wept part of Scripture. But even beyond that, have you read Confessions by Augustine?
Yes.
So I think it was Augustine that wrote in there. There was people who were like celebrating death in the early Christian times because they're like, oh yeah, resurrection's gonna be great, and so they were like partying and saying like, this is great, they're dead. And Augustine, or whoever it is that I'm thinking of, I'm pretty sure it's Augustine, wrote to them and is like, no, you do not celebrate death. Like, it's still something that needs to be grieved. You have hope for them.
Yeah.
And you pray for them, but you don't celebrate it. And so there's kind of like all those different aspects of it. It's definitely something that you need to experience, but not let consume you on either aspect of it.
Yes. And I have one final theme.
Okay.
It's very short, but there is also this little dynamic between Miles' dad and Miles' uncle.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
Miles' uncle, Aaron, he's very close with, he's the one who does graffiti with them, actually ends up being a supervillain.
Mm-hmm.
And when he finds out who Miles is, he gets shot because he like lets him go because he like realizes that the Spider-Man he's been trying to kill is actually his nephew that he loves. And Wilson Fisk shoots him for it. And so he gets out of there. And Miles' dad had kind of grown distant from his brother. They've just grown different. And this is something that Aaron mentions in the beginning. He's like, your dad and I used to come down here and do this graffiti all the time.
His dad's a cop now.
But he's like, now he's a cop and he's too good for it. And there's a scene where Miles is all wrapped up. And this is actually, I think, probably the moment where he comes to fruition. Is his dad knocks and is like, something bad happened. He's like, and he thinks his son's just ignoring him, right? But he's actually becoming Spider-Man trying to save the world.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, your uncle and I grew apart, and I just don't want that to happen to us.
Yeah.
That there was this sense that Miles' dad realized that he had helped let them grow apart, but there was always a moment for reconciliation.
I think that's the healthy side of grief being shown. So we have Wilson Fisk, or Kingpin is his villain name, showing the unhealthy side, but the dad in this moment is showing the grief from his brother, Aaron, dying, coming to his son, right? And trying to mend that relationship rather than to close things off or act out in a violent or a way that's not him. He's becoming less of himself. That's not what Miles' father's doing. He's doing the healthy path. Yeah,
and there's this, and I actually love Miles and his dad's relationship in this movie, because it is actually just which you never see it in cinema, like the tender sort of relationship between a father and the son. Oftentimes it's this,
not at the beginning. At the beginning, it's very strained.
It's still a tender relationship, in terms of his father is still a very tender father to him.
Sure,
still loves him. I mean, he embarrasses the heck out of him.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
But his father loves him.
Yeah.
And you don't often see very many movies where a father is like, I love you, to their son.
Right.
Over and over and over throughout the movie.
I think there's something to be said to that, too, now that you remind me of it, because that's very much our relationship with God the Father, too.
Yeah.
Because Miles was very embarrassed, very awkward about it, and very anti-affection with his father. And we can be that way, too. God's like, I love you. And we just ignore him. God's like, I love you.
And so this happens throughout the movie, right?
Yeah.
Which I love.
Yeah, I forgot about that too. I apparently forgot about this whole movie.
Yeah, and there's a scene where he's the scene where he's talking about it and he's trying to mend the relationship and his son can't reply. Because in the very beginning he says, I love you. And then he's like, I know, Dad. And he walks off and then he gets on the speaker in front of everyone at the school and he's like, you have to say it back. And he's like, are you serious? Look where I am right now. He's like, you have to say it back. And he's like, I love you, Dad. And he goes inside. And then when he's knocking on the door, he's like, hey, he's Miles. He's like, I love you. And then you don't have to say it back.
Yeah.
And he walks off, and Miles can't. You can see he wants to, but he's like, he can't.
His mouth is
covered. And so then there's that scene where he's dressed as Spider-Man, and he sits there and he is talking to him, and he's like, thank you, officer. And he's like, I love you. It sounds like, wait, what?
Yeah.
He doesn't know it's his son. But it's it's this, I don't know, it's still kind of a beautiful, it's funny, but it's a beautiful moment.
Yeah.
So.
That's true. I'm glad you thought of that. I completely blanked.
Yeah. Anything else? I think that's pretty much all I have.
No, I mean, I'm blanking on the rest of the movie right now, so unless you have anything.
No, you have any shout-outs for the week?
I do, actually. So I forgot to say these from last week's episode, but Gordon and I were on Brave and Expedition the other week, and one of the chaperones on my side, Expedition, which is the junior high side, was a woman by the name of Karen, who, do you remember BCYM? Did you ever have to take that?
I'm familiar with it, yeah.
So BCYM is basic Catholic youth ministry training certificate.
Yeah.
So every youth minister in the diocese is supposed to take it at some point, and not going to lie, it's a pretty boring and awful course. Sorry if anyone from the diocese is listening. But, yeah, so Karen sat next to me during my BCYM, and I hadn't seen her since that class. So it was kind of cool to talk to her again. So shout out to her, but also her daughter was chaperoning too, and I found out that Karen had told her daughter Emma about the show too. So apparently they know about it or are listening. So shout out to those two. Hopefully you guys are listening at this point.
Rock on. Yeah. I already kind of shouted out Anthony a little bit earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I think my biggest shout out, so those who know me personally, and I guess actually know us personally, I'm going to shout out Katerina.
Yeah.
We have a friend of ours who recently passed away, so just a shout out to her and her family. And we would just ask our listeners to please keep them in your prayers. This is kind of a sad thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So, close friend of ours who passed away a couple weeks ago. And I guess with that, unless you have a challenge, I think a good challenge would be to grieve.
Yeah.
Right? In a healthy way. For those of us who knew Katerina,
Mm-hmm.
Grieve over that. Take the time to do that if you haven't already. And even if you don't know her, grieve with us.
Yeah. And my thing too, just on terms with that, things can end very abruptly. My challenge also for y'all would be, if there are relationships where you've grown distant from somebody, you've let something get between you, somebody very close, I would encourage you for your challenge this week to actually extend the olive branch to go and try to rekindle those relationships, to not let sometimes our short-sighted angers ruin something that is otherwise good.
Right.
And just to work toward reconciliation with those people in your life.
It's a good one. All right. Anything else?
That's it.
So before we start wrapping things up here, I do want to make kind of an announcement. So this week we are going to be recording with John Blevins. So that is the older brother of the Fortnite streamer Ninja. And he has a Fortnite stream as well, and is also a Catholic director of evangelization up in Chicago. So we're going to be having him on the show hopefully next week. But we're really excited about that. So please tune in for that one. It's going to be a fun one. And with that, you guys hopefully know where to reach us, but you can find in our notes section below, Twitter @OnTheAdventure2, Facebook, The Christ and Culture. You can find us on SoundCloud. You can find us on YouTube, The Christ and Culture. Check out our website, thechristinculture.com. You can find all of our stuff there, including if you want to support us on Patreon and become a patron for as little as $5 a month, you can become one of our patrons and get rewards back. So even if you don't want to do $5 a month, if you want to do $1, you can do that. There just won't be any bonus rewards with that. But we appreciate all of our patrons. You guys are awesome. And we are sending out some special bonus episodes for our patrons too. So hopefully you guys are getting those and enjoying those as well.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us on the adventure.
We'll see you next week.
Hey, a little bit of a postscript here. There's a scene going off of Grief.
Yeah.
Where Miles is grieving over his uncle. And he's like, you guys don't understand. And all of the Spider-Men who, if you guys know the story of Spider-Man and Uncle Ben, they say, well, actually, everyone in this room might be the only ones who really understand.
Yeah.
And, and
the one's like, yeah, for me it was my Uncle Ben. The other one's like, it was my Uncle Benjamin. And then the little girl's like, for me it was my father. And they each go through and they say like who their loss was. And
I think it's important to remember that that's such a central theme of Spider-Man, is this, with great power comes great responsibility, but it's out of this grief for generally Uncle Ben.
Yeah. Right?
And so it's kind of like out of great grief comes great responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's Spider-Man.
It's the name of this episode.